Faultlines. Faultlines.
Welcome back to Faultlines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Right now, basically the fight is taking place on whether to impeach Donald Trump. But there's another fight that's taking place that's just as important, at least to us. In fact, not just important, infinitely more important than what is taking place right now in regards to Trump. There's a fight over whether to raise the minimum wage. Now, right now, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, and under the Biden stimulus plan, they're trying to raise that to $15 an hour. Now, the House has done it. Now, the plan is to use budget reconciliation to pull this off, and the House, like I said, have done it. The question becomes the Senate. Joe Biden most likely will sign this because this was something that Joe Biden ran on. So whether or not Sanders, at the top of the Senate Budget Committee, can shepherd this through using budget reconciliation. And that's the interesting question. Will it work? Keep in mind, before COVID hit, 42% of the public was only making $18,000 a year. And if we were talking about wages keeping up with productivity, that number will be over $20 an hour. So 15 is modest to call it that way. So the CBO did an estimate. And the CBO's estimate, I would say conservative, makes the point that it's going to cost $54 billion over 10 years, and it's going to gradually increase the minimum wage $15 an hour. But they also make the point that it would cost 1.4 million jobs. This is often overstated, and I have all sorts of research to make that point. But before we get into the research to talk about it, let's bring on Steve Grumbine. Steve Grumbine is a good friend of the show. He's a political, economic, and social justice activist, founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, a 501c3 and 501c4, respectively, dedicated to education and advocacy for modern monetary theory. Steve, what's on, man? How you doing?
Man, I'm doing good, man. I'm sorry to hear you've been demonetized. I saw that. I was really upset. So
yeah, I was really upset too. Because look, if I do something wrong, like if I put something up, fair enough. Like if I made a mistake once and put up a video, it wasn't intentional. I just got it wrong. The other people were calling it something else and I got it wrong. And they shut it down for like a week. Okay, fair enough. I don't like it. I think it's aggravating. I don't think you should do it. But at the very least, I kind of get it. But when it's nothing, oh man, I was apoplectic over that. Because there's nothing in my content that's harmful. And so to kind of defame me in that way, it was a big, big deal. But let's get on to the economics of this, because I'm actually pretty excited for this. Joe Biden campaigned on $50 an hour, and he seems to be willing to do it. Now, the House Democrats basically put it in the bill, the stimulus package, and it passed the House. So now it goes to the Senate for budget reconciliation, and that's where the question comes in. Issues of pay-go, issues of whether or not this directly affects the budget enough, all of those type of things come into play. The thing I want to get to, though, is the effects of this and the way that they've overstated the negative effects. So there's research here, right here. Wolfson, Paul J., and Bellman Dale, 15 years research on U.S. employment and minimum wage. They're basically making the argument that the effect on unemployment is negligible, while the impact is substantial. I mean, and even the New York Times makes the point, or these guys make the point, that 27 million low-wage workers would get a raise. So how do you look at this, Steve, when you're looking at this, especially from your point of view? I mean, this just seems like right policy, especially if you want to get people out of poverty.
Yeah, I look at this as $15 an hour is better than $8 an hour, but it is definitely not great. I mean, if you were looking at keeping up with inflation going way back, you'd be looking at minimum of $23 an hour, and some estimates talk about even over $30 an hour. So, this is, a good thing because clearly people will have more, income to make life decisions with. The question is it enough? And do we go back to sleep because we patted ourselves on the back because we bumped it up to $15 an hour? Now, the economic impact is a little different because you think about, people say, well, that business now, they got this extra weight on their shoulders by having to pay these people a living wage. And, my perspective is if you can't afford to pay a living wage, you don't deserve to be in business.
Exactly.
But on the
Exactly.
flip side
Man,
of that,
that's so
though,
right. That's so right. Because it's
the
like
flip
if you got
side,
to open a business, you should be able to. It should be sustainable. Like it's like, well, I can make this business work if I pay kids $2 an hour. Well, maybe that business shouldn't work that way.
exactly. I would go so far as to say that it's not just in the benefit of the employee, though, that this raise has happened, because the local community where that individual resides, he now has the money to take staying in the male form here. Anyone has the ability now to take their significant other or their family or whatever out to dinner, or maybe they order through, the DoorDash or whatever. But the fact is that people have some disposable income, or they're getting closer to being able to pay their bills. And that's more money in the local community. So there's local businesses that are complaining about having to pay their employee $15 an hour. Well, they get somebody else's $15 an hour employee coming to their business to patronize them. So this is a net win for everyone, albeit not nearly as big a win as it should be. And it should be no sweat off the government's back unless it's going to subsidize those wages, really. This is more a matter of making sure that the economy itself has enough lubricant in it to stay afloat. And, hats off to Biden administration for doing something right, but it's still not anywhere near enough. And there's plenty of other economic points he's made that, in my opinion, kind of counter this, just simply with his resistance on survival payments alone. But just moving on from there, I think that it's easy to get sucked into this because it's better than we've seen. But I think there's other counteracting steps Biden's taken that kind of offset this in the negative way, unfortunately.
Well, let's come back to that in just a minute. But on the minimum wage, we've been speaking about this stuff so far purely in terms of the economic benefit. There is of course the implicit human benefit, which is that if you have a livable wage, if you're making relative to say 1965 or 1970, when wage stagnation was still new or had barely begun, hadn't really begun at that point, you would be able to support a family usually on one income. And then we went through this 50-year arc where it went from one income to two incomes in the household to people going into debt, taking on credit, to now being seriously in debt. And for a lot of folks getting older, you can look at this just in terms of national, not demographics, but in terms of like the national birth rate and how easy it is for people to have kids, buy a house, build a family, do the sort of basic building blocks of any society. It's gotten harder and harder. And so for a lot of people, the whole double income, no kids thing, where you're both working, whatever your choices are, I don't care. It's not up to me. But I think a lot of people are in that position because they don't feel that they have a choice. Because in their eyes, raising kids and giving them a good life has gotten more and more expensive. And this is, again, after about 50 years, more than a generation now of long-run wage stagnation. How do you think coming back to Biden's other economic policy, some of the other stuff that you're a little bit more skeptical of or pessimistic about, how do you think that is going to affect what we're talking about here, this long-run economic stagnation for the individual, for the family, in society? What's your take on that, Steve?
So if you look at the United States, we look back in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of the boomers, if you will, paid next to nothing for college, for example. I mean, literally next to nothing. And throughout, our domestic economy, you see people had, I don't want to say an easier life, but they didn't have to work as long. I mean, I just talk anecdotally about my own family. When my father got off at 3:30 in the afternoon, he drove home an hour from work. It was 4:30. He quickly changed into his athletic shorts and his team jersey and put his ball cap on and took us down to the field, and we played baseball, and he coached our team, and he had time to do that. And those things are a luxury now. Most families, the father or mother doesn't get to coach the kids' team because they're stretched to the end. And, with COVID, obviously the team is not as great of a analogy in some respects, but you can see throughout time that as neoliberalism eats into the public purpose, the public space, it takes away from families' ability to do these nice extra things that make a person whole. It's like a full 360 person, just rather than being an autonomous work unit. You actually get to be a family man or woman. They get to be a child again. They get to read a book instead of feeling rushed to doing something else. And what neoliberalism does is it eats into public space and privatizes it. And you can see that every time neoliberalism starts to choke on, dryness because the economy is tightening up, they end up privatizing some other part of the public space. And this race to the bottom, this perpetual privatization scheme, is what makes the two-family income, two incomes in the family, a requirement. It's the type of thing that's adding to, having to take on private debt to maintain a lifestyle you had 10 years ago today. It's all those things as you watch things that you once took for granted. You had a pension, you had 30 years at a job. Now you're lucky if you get a contract job for a year or 6 months. So stability has been wiped out. Instability has been put in. Precarity is part of the recipe for this scenario. And so when Biden doesn't give enough money for people to do these things, these other programs where he says, hey, I'll give you $10,000 off on your student debt instead of eradicating that student debt, really what you're doing is you're saying, hey, look, I did this thing, but this thing doesn't have substantive impact on people's lives. It's good on paper, but $10,000 over 20 years when your student loans are $100,000 is nothing. It's absolutely nothing. But it sounds good. It looks good in the copy in the newspaper. So I think that you've got a lot of fluffy, anecdotal type things, and you've got people who are living real lives that have to do something else beyond just go to their 9-to-5 job to make life bearable, to make it what it was 10 years ago. And people are still trying to strive for that, but we keep getting reduced and reduced and reduced. And I think that's what you're going to see. I think you're going to see a lot more of that, unfortunately. I'm hoping. I mean, my fingers are crossed. I want Biden to be successful in our way. If he's successful, I will be cheering from the rooftops. But everything that I've seen so far has indicated that he's going to check a lot of boxes, and the people on the other end are not going to receive a lot of benefits. And I think people are underestimating the net effect of this 40, 50-year neoliberal curse that we as the United States are now exporting around the world because we are looking to open markets up because markets have dried. So they keep opening new markets by privatizing the UK, by privatizing Australia, by privatizing.
No, Steve, we need to go into a break. A point completely taken and agreed. And just to sum up, and we'll be back with you in just a minute, it sounds like you're saying Biden's economic policies are marginal improvements in some spheres, but what you're worried about is they're going to be taken, they're pretending to be real fixes for deeper problems. They're going to be taken by the media as real fixes for deeper problems, and we're not actually going to focus on solving those problems. I believe that's what you were saying. We'll be back in a minute, and you can confirm or deny or revise. We're joined by Steve Grumbine, political, economic, and social justice activist and founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. You're listening to Faultlines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Steve in just a minute.
Faultlines. Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us. Faultlines.
Welcome back to Faultlines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Continuing to join us is Steve Grumbine, political, economic, and social justice activist and founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, a 501c3 and 501c4, respectively dedicated to education and advocacy. for modern monetary theory. Steve, I want to piggyback on the conversation we were having earlier, the conversation we were having with Shane. The issue of freedom, the issue of freedom. You made the point about how when people were younger, in the 60s or whatever, they could basically work a job and then the wife could stay at home and send the kids to school and everything else. And as we start privatizing all of these things, well, that burden went to the person, that burden went to the individual. And it got so typical, so normal because people were born into it, they just thought that was normal, even though it was not normal, nor was it in their best interest. I'm going to get to this topic of freedom. There is no corporeal point to our existence, right? I mean, we don't necessarily know. And so it is utterly bizarre that we take the opportunity, we use this life to toil away, to give resources to other people. That is so bizarre to me. We should organize our society in a way, even our job space, that allows a certain degree of freedom. And even if you got health and school, just those two items would be greatly beneficial to eliminating much of the poverty at the bottom that neoliberalism has basically instantiated. How do we pay for it? Is the question that they always ask. It's like, hey, how do we pay for that jobs program? How do we pay for this $15 minimum wage? How do we pay for it, Steve? Is it so out of the realm of possibility for the government itself, or is it possible to have a lifestyle like that, have a government that supports a lifestyle like that? What do you think? I know you're in a modern monetary theory, so you should have a really interesting explanation for this that I think is important.
Government space was eliminated and it was privatized. Well, clearly at one point in time we were able to do it, right? There's a lot of things that we can do right here, right now, that would radically change the lives of every American, and it would take no effort whatsoever. The only effort it would really take is the political will and the votes to pass it. Our nation, like many nations, Russia, Japan, Australia, the UK, China, all these nations have what is known as monetary sovereignty, or they are the currency issuer. And they have the ability to absorb shocks and whatever happens in the economy. And they have the ability to spend money into existence. And not just the ability, this is how they do it. They all spend money into existence. That's what keeps the economy going. And to take the edge off an overheating economy, they have the ability to raise taxes. That is the way they offset inflation. That is the way they make people socially engineer the goods and the bads in society. And unfortunately, right now, you see a lot of bads being rewarded and a lot of goods being taxed, and a lot of people having to work extra hard to feed their families, to take care of medical expenses, et cetera, as we've stated many times. So MMT, the basic insight here is that a government can afford anything for sale in its currency because it creates its currency with keystrokes. In the case of our U.S. government, our Congress authorizes spending via Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. They pass those instructions on to a president who signs that bill into law. It goes over to the Federal Reserve, who then marks up the accounts of the Treasury, who then in turn spends that money out to wherever the bill said to spend it to. We don't print money sitting in a vault somewhere that we just go and take those big old fat stacks, Breaking Bad style, and start spending them. We spend money into existence based on a law or a bill or a stabilizer or some other trigger that our Congress has put into play. And so any of these things that you just mentioned, we could get rid of student debt, we could get a Green New Deal, we could have a job guarantee, and we wouldn't even have to blink. It's that simple. And I don't mean to make it sound like it's that easy. The hard part is that we've got a neoliberal leadership that wants Wall Street to win. And you see the way they handled just the GameStop stock. So ultimately, our leadership wants capital to win, and it wants regular people to have to be in precarity so that they can keep feeding the capital game. And you made a great point of organizing society, organizing workplaces. People are afraid of that S word, that socialism word. But in reality, socialism is a spectrum. And we should be looking at ways to make everyone's lives better. We should be looking at ways of gaining equity for people that have been marginalized. And we should be looking for ways to just make society better, whether it be investing in arts and sciences, whether it be investing in community projects, whatever it is that society thinks it needs. There's nothing financial about our inability to pay for them. We could do it yesterday. The issue is not conflating states and local municipalities with the federal government, who has the sole power of currency creation via Congress. Not bank lending, which people confuse, but actually net financial assets spent into existence by the United States Congress. That is a very key thing here. And anything that you just mentioned, if it can be purchased in U.S. dollars, it can be done in U.S. dollars, and it can be done today, as long as we have the real resources.
So that actually, this is a conversation we've had before, and one we should have again soon. We only have so much time. I want to turn to something you were hinting at towards the tail end there. You were talking about the distinguishment between bank lending and the creation of money, and federal lending, or really the creation of the actual creation of money by the federal government under a fiat currency system. Let's talk about Wall Street for a minute. This is partly triggered by what happened with GameStop, but I also saw you talking about Ferdinand Pecora and the Pecora Commission, the Pecora hearings, which I didn't know about this. A lot of folks probably don't know about this. On the tail end of the Great Depression, Ferdinand Pecora was, I believe, the chief prosecutor who was investigating, and please correct me if I'm wrong, who was investigating Wall Street crimes that had led to the Great Depression, speculation, shorting, and effectively the power of the institutional investor over the retail investor. This is something we saw again just a couple of weeks ago. That's largely how the GameStop story has been portrayed. A band of Redditors over at Wall Street Bets, a band of people on the internet, decided to gang up against big institutional investors and actually managed to beat them for a while, for a couple of days there, where massive institutional investors lost many billions of dollars in unwise, let's just use that word, unwise shorts on the value of GameStop. But this also led to a lot of folks at the time talking about the sort of hiding in plain sight problems we have on Wall Street, in the sense that after 2008 and 2009, after the last financial collapse, the last big one, nothing really got done. The banks got bailed out. Nobody actually solved the underlying problem. And so there's this sort of pent up need to actually address the deeper problems on Wall Street. Can you tell us a little bit about Ferdinand Pecora, just briefly, as well as what a Pecora of 2021 or 2022 might look like? What would they be focused on solving? And do you see them actually coming into existence? Do you see us trying to solve those problems today, Steve?
Funny you asked that. I was on the Misfits the other day, and I raised this. We're getting ready to start a podcast called The New Untouchables, the Pecora Files, and that comes out on Valentine's Day. That'll be our first episode that comes out. We got regulators like Bill Black and whistleblowers from Citibank, you name it, on there. It's going to be fantastic. That said, Pecora was a Republican. He wasn't a particularly Wall Street-driven guy. He didn't understand stocks. He didn't understand markets. What he did understand was fraud, and he understood control fraud. And so for the first time, and maybe the last time, we actually had someone prosecuting white-collar crime that was going after the dogs out there that were shorting, that were messing with, the financial welfare of the United States. And this guy, Pecora, did something heroic. Now, Pecora, unearthed all the control fraud and all the different things that you saw these underhanded people doing, and for once, the country took action. Today,
well, this also led to the Security Exchange Commission, right?
Absolutely, but just at a more layperson level, just at a regular person level, the average person saw the Obama administration completely whiff on this. They said they're too big to jail, too big to fail, too big to jail, and left these folks go. In fact, Robert Rubin's of the world and the Jamie Dimons of the world and so many other criminals keep resurfacing, not only in our government, but they keep resurfacing at other Wall Street ventures. So these people have been committing fraud forever. This is a recipe. Our entire banking system is predicated on fraud, unfortunately. Not to say that our banking system is bad. It's to say that we need a Glass-Steagall, a modern-day regulatory piece of legislation that will stop the speculative behavior. In fact, I think we should make shorting illegal. I think shorting brings about the worst behaviors in business. And I think that it's vital that we have a PCORA hearing, but it's going to require us telling the public that this is even possible. You raised the great point earlier. People are growing up in a neoliberal era, and they have no idea that it can be any different. Well, people have never heard of anybody actually prosecuting Wall Street before.
If you were born and raised and died during that entire time, your life had been just in this kind of neoliberal politics. If you were in the previous generation, it wouldn't have been true. But just by growing up in it, it warps your mind, man. It's like if you drop somebody in the middle of, I don't know, Timbuktu, they're going to act or function like that, especially if it's like that every day of their life. And so it's like in our particular case, we have this really bizarre, it's very strange. That's all. I'm sorry, Steve, please continue.
No, you nailed it. And I think everybody, I'm hoping that this podcast helps educate people. We've got Patrick Lovell, we've got Eric Vaughn, two of the greatest Hollywood bangers out there that they're investigative. I feel like, there's very few people out there better than Jordan when it comes to unearthing stuff. These guys have really unearthed. They went further than The Big Short. And I'm hoping that this podcast will draw out those characters, draw out the control fraud that's going on underneath, show you the structural problem. Well, we have over 2,000.
Wait, Steve, we're about at a time, and I want to make sure we get this in. You said this is coming out Valentine's Day. That's this Sunday. Before we go, where can people find that? Where can people find the new Untouchables?
Thank you. It's going to be on our website, www.realprogressives.org. Under media, you'll be able to find the new Untouchables there. I'm really hopeful that everyone digs in and enjoys it.
Steve, yeah, folks, go check that out. Hopefully we can have you back on soon, Steve, but we got to go.
Faultlines.